In this unit, we're going to discuss cryptographic algorithms, specifically public key infrastructure, and also certificates, which are important for trust. So, public algorithms. When we talk about public algorithms, we're talking about cryptography that is based on algorithms that are widely known and well understood. In other words, rather than using proprietary algorithms where the inner workings of the cryptography is not well understood, with public algorithms, the mathematics behind the encryption technology or the cryptographic technology is very well understood. It's available for public review. Anybody could use those algorithms. With a few exceptions, some of them are proprietary, but yet they're still in some sense public in that the underpinnings, the mathematics that support it are public. They're definitely much more secure when they're well understood. The flaws, any flaws that might be present in those algorithms, can be fleshed out through all the people that have access to it and are reviewing it and seeing it work and able to work with it. So, a public algorithm, while everybody knows how to use a knob to open a door without the key to unlock the knob, that knowledge is useless, which is basically how public algorithms work. So what we're talking about here is a lot of these algorithms. A lot of people say, well, if people know, if people understand how these algorithms work, doesn't it make it more likely that they could break these algorithms? They could break these technologies, and that's really the power of these public key, Well, really, all these public algorithms is, even in spite of understanding how they work, that understanding actually proves how powerful they are and how secure they actually are. So that's an important concept there, is that even though they're public, even though they're well understood and well known, doesn't mean that they're not secure. In fact, I would argue, and I think many security experts would argue, that that having algorithms that are proprietary, where you don't have that peer review of the algorithms, is actually less secure, even though it's less likely somebody could go and pick it apart and find the flaws. That doesn't mean that the flaws are not there, and somebody could still discover those flaws. So, as far as in this unit, really, I broke it down into two parts. We're going to start by talking about different cryptographic algorithms and standards that we use. So we're going to talk about all the standards. Now, in a previous course, you should have already discussed the concepts of cryptography, where you learned how public key cryptography and symmetric and asymmetric cryptography work, and what sort of what the differences are between those. So we're going to expand on that knowledge. So knowing what the public key cryptography is, and asymmetric and symmetric, and how they work and how we use those. I'm going to talk specifically about standards and also hashing. I'm going to talk specifically about standards that we use to implement those cryptography technologies. So I'm going to talk about specific standards. And the first one we're going to talk about is hashing. So we've obviously talked about hashing in previous slide decks. In other courses, of course, you talked about hashing. The precursor to this course, the prerequisite rather for this course, talks about how hashes work and why we use them. But there's basically two main standards that we use for hashing. One is SHA and the other one is Message Digest, or MD. So those are the two main ones. So a hashing function is usually used for one-way encryption, just to review your memory here from the previous course. So once an algorithm is processed, there is no feasible way to use a ciphertext to retrieve the plain text. In other words, you take a plain text, you use the hashing algorithm to produce a signature or some value, but that value cannot be used to get back to the plain text. That's not the purpose of one-way encryption and hashing algorithms. It's really more about a signature. It's about using a signature to identify the authenticity of a message. So the two popular hash algorithms are secure hash algorithm, or SHA, which is a series of standards, and then the Message Digest, or MD standards, MD2, MD4, MD5, and so forth. So basically, with a hash function, you start with the original text. You usually have to pad it so that it's a certain length. Most of the hashing algorithms that we talk about, whether it's SHA or MD, they require the payload to be a certain length for the algorithm to work correctly. So you pad it, typically with zeros, and then you run it through the hash function, and you get a message digest on the other side, and that's the signature for that file. So they're typically used for storing passwords, message integrity, so you know that the message hasn't been adulterated in transit. I think we've talked about a lot of this in the past, though. One of the problems with hashing algorithms, so one of the things that we want to look out for, the only purpose, a hashing algorithm has one job, and it is to verify either verify the authenticity of a file or ensure that somebody put in a value that matches what was originally put in, as in the case with passwords. So it would be a major flaw if a hash algorithm, if it was possible with a hashing algorithm to produce two files that have the same hash or the same output from the hashing algorithm, if those two files are different. If there's any change between the two files, you shouldn't be able to get the same hash. And that's what a collision attack is all about. Collision attacks are where somebody finds a way to produce the same signature from a different file, from a different input. So, and you should not be able to do that. That shouldn't be possible. At least mathematically, it's not supposed to be possible. But people have discovered ways to do that. And when that happens, when somebody finds some way to produce the same hash, then that pretty much destroys the underpinnings of that algorithm and what hashing is supposed to do. So it's a major concern, and that's the number one thing we're looking out for as far as attacks on hashing algorithms. And almost all of the major hashing algorithms that are out today, to some extent, could be susceptible to a collision attack. And without a doubt, some of them have been shown to be susceptible to collision attack. So SHA is, which is the secure hash algorithm, refers to 4 hash algorithms that were published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is what's adopted by FIPS. So it applies compression to the data input. It accepts up to 2 to the 64 bits or less, and then compresses it down to a smaller number of bits, and then you end up with your hash. Most of the algorithms use block mode to process data to create the hash. I haven't talked in this unit about block versus stream algorithms. But block algorithms is where you take groups of bits as opposed to one byte at a time or something like that. So they break the data into blocks of 512. SHA does. So if a file was 1400 bits long, it would create 3 blocks, with the third one being padded with zeros to get to 512. So that's basically how SHA works. There's 4 variants of SHA. You have SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-384, and SHA-512. SHA-1 was one of the more secure hash algorithms. I shouldn't say most, but was one of the more secure. But it has been found to be vulnerable to a collision attack. So the longer versions are referred to as SHA-2. So SHA-256, SHA-384, SHA-512. That's SHA-2, which is a bit more secure and has not, as of yet, been shown to be susceptible to a collision attack. There's also a SHA-3, which I think came out not too long ago, but it's not in this slide deck here. But there is another another extension to SHA, which is SHA-3, which was recently adopted as a standard. So you can certainly look into SHA-3 as well. I believe SHA-3 works much better on mobile platforms. So it's a little bit better for for those types of processors as far as the performance goes. But in any event, SHA-2 is certainly much more secure in that it is less susceptible to those collision attacks that were alluded to with SHA-1. There are some older older hashing algorithms, which is message digest. These are significantly older than SHA. They work very similar to SHA, but the underpinning mathematics is a little bit different. There were 3 versions: MD2, MD4, and MD5. So MD2 was developed back in 1989, and it's an early version of MD5. It takes data of any length and produces a hash output of 128 bits, and it's optimized for 8-bit machines. MD4 and MD5 are optimized for 32-bit machines, which is a little more modern. So MD4 was developed in 1990, so only a year later, and optimized for 32-bit. And then, of course, we get MD5, which is most common today. If you're going to use one of these MD variants, MD5 is most commonly used out of these 3. It was developed in 1991, so just a year after MD4. It's very similar to MD4, but a little bit slower, but far more secure. And it creates a 128-bit hash, just like MD2 and MD4. So MD5, the problem with MD5 is it also has a collision vulnerability. In fact, it's I think it's actually almost arbitrary now to do a collision attack with MD5. There's actually a nice tutorial online where somebody has a virtual machine that you can spin up in Azure or in Amazon. I think it's just a Linux machine that you can spin up, and you can use that virtual machine to create files that will have any MD5 hash that you provide. So you can basically plug in a 128-bit signature that you want a file to get, and it will basically modify the file so that it'll have that signature. So you can basically make any file have the same signature. And I think the demonstration that's used in that VM is using images. So you can produce different images that have the same hash. So obviously it's pretty vulnerable, the MD5 for sure. So SHA is definitely a better option right now. Another algorithm, not as common unless you're in Windows, is NTLM. So NTLM was the hash algorithm that was used by Windows. I believe it's still used by Windows in systems that are not a domain controller. I think domain controllers use something different, but NTLM is how it stores your password, basically. So NTLM was used by Windows for storing passwords. So hashing functions are very common. They play an important role for storing passwords, signing messages, and for maintaining message integrity, which we've talked about previously. We haven't talked about signing messages too much yet, but we are going to talk about that in this unit later on. I'll discuss using hashing algorithms for signing messages. So key management, the security of algorithms relies on the key. So key management is critical concern, includes anything having to do with exchange, storage, safeguarding, and revocation of keys. So a key must be current and verified. This is kind of a little bit out of sequence here, but we're going to talk about keys going forward because we're going to be talking about symmetric and asymmetric algorithms here in a few minutes, and keys, of course, are very important for asymmetric encryption algorithms. But one thing I want to talk about real quick before we go forward is the Trusted Platform Module, or TPM. So when you're storing keys, like for example, if you use BitLocker in Windows, starting with Windows Vista, Windows came standard with a whole disk encryption, and that whole disk encryption has to rely on some symmetric key, and TPM allows you to store that symmetric key in hardware. So there's hardware that has that symmetric key. So if you separate a drive from the hardware, you can't use that data. Of course, there's some issues with TPM as far as there's both issues with being able to circumvent TPM by having the hardware, and also not being able to access data because you've lost that hardware. So there's definitely some concerns there. But in your book, they discuss TPM, and I just wanted to mention it briefly here. But what I really want to talk about in this unit is, now that we've discussed hashing algorithms to some extent, I want to also talk about some of the different protocols that we use for symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption, which, again, we've learned about symmetric and asymmetric encryption in a previous unit, in a previous class, rather. So now I want to talk about the specific algorithms we use. So you should already understand how symmetric encryption works. Basically you have a shared key, so it's the same key, the same passphrase or key to unencrypt and decrypt the data, or unencrypt and encrypt the data. And these are the various standards. So the oldest one that your book talks about is DES, developed in 1973 and adopted as a federal standard in 1976. So it's a pretty old encryption algorithm, old by computing standards. Obviously, DES is not recommended anymore. Most systems use something other than DES, something newer than DES. But I'll talk about some of the other standards as well. Although you still see it in VPNs and things like that. And a lot of students ask me when we start talking about these encryption algorithms in class, they'll say, where am I going to see these? What's an example of when I'm going to use this in the real world? And if any of you have set up VPNs, that's the most common place you're going to see all this stuff. And VPNs are a pretty important part of IT security. It's a lot of what we do in IT security is setting up VPNs between different companies and organizations, and even within our own companies and all that sort of thing. There really is no way to have secure communication without using encryption. And that's an important reason that we use VPNs. So when you're configuring a VPN, and even when you're working with things like SSL and TLS, In a lot of cases, we have to know a little bit about these standards. But if you're setting up a VPN, one of the first things you have to determine with whomever you're setting up the VPN is which encryption standard you're going to use to encrypt the symmetric encryption standard. You also have to decide with asymmetric encryption standard, and you also have to decide which hash algorithm you're going to use. But DES is our first choice. Well, we don't want to use DES if we don't have to, but that's that's the oldest option that you have that most VPN devices and encryption devices will support. So the block size with DES is 64 bits of plain text, which gives you 64 bits of ciphertext. The key length is 56-bit. So we only have a 56-bit key. That's a relatively small key for a symmetric encryption algorithm by today's standards. So it's been pretty common for about 20 years, but modern computing power has made the key very breakable. So I think most of us probably don't have sufficient computing power to easily break DES, especially if the key is being changed frequently, at least not in real time. We'd have to capture that traffic and replay it, although perfect forward secrecy should prevent that sort of thing from happening. But it's not impossible, and I'm sure that our government probably has the ability to break DES relatively easily. They may even have some back doors. It's been around for an awful long time. There's a lot of flaws with it. So DES is definitely not the best choice, but the next choice we have is triple DES, or 3DES, which most people pronounce it triple DES. Triple DES is essentially the same thing as DES, but you do it 3 times. So it's DES encryption, but done 3 times. And I have a little graphic here that kind of explains how it works. So with triple DES, you start out with the plain text. First, you use the first key. So you have 3 different keys. The first key encrypts the data the first time. Then you take that key and encrypt the data a second time. And then you take the third key and you encrypt the data a third time. So you're taking encrypted data, encrypting it again, and encrypting it a third time. So you're basically encrypting 3 times with 3 different keys. And then when it gets to the other side, they're going to decrypt that data in the reverse order using those same 3 keys. So starting with the last key going to the first key. It does make this encryption algorithm significantly stronger. By today's standards, triple DES is okay. It's not the best, but it's an okay option. It's an acceptable option, I should say. So triple DES is an acceptable option for encryption. I would say for normal business communication, it's an acceptable option. If it's top secret, if it's military, government, and things like that, they generally, I think, will not use triple DES. But for business communication, for what most of us do, triple DES is certainly fine. So that's the other encryption algorithm. And then sort of the cream of the crop as far as these ES standards is AES, which is the Advanced Encryption Standard. It's got a block cipher that separates data input into 128-bit blocks, so it's significantly bigger, but you can also configure it to use 192 or 256. And that's great, but what really makes AES stronger, number one, the algorithm and how it works is a lot better. But number two, you can have a key that's much longer. So you can have a much higher key. So you can have a 128-bit key, 192 or 256-bit key. If you recall, DES has a key that's 56 bits. If you use triple DES, it's 3 56-bit keys. Here we can have a single key with 256 bits. For sure, it's going to be, number one, it's going to be a little more efficient if we only have to encrypt the data once. And we only have to encrypt it once because we have a key that's so much more secure for that one encryption cycle. So 256 bits is pretty good. 128 bits is even, way better than what we had with 56-bit. But 256-bit just knocks it out of the park. It's much better. There currently does not exist any known efficient attacks against AES, at least not known to us in the civilian and private sector. There may be attacks in military and government that we're not aware of, but for the most part, I think most of us in the private sector and civilian and business communications, we're not too concerned about that sort of thing. We probably should be to some extent, but the due diligence that we have to take in IT security in an organization like that, AES is certainly more than sufficient. AES is probably going to be our number one choice if we're doing encryption, and we need to use symmetric encryption. We're probably going to choose AES over all of the other algorithms if possible. So a lot of students will ask me, Brian, why are we learning about triple DES and DES if AES is the cat's pajamas and it's the best encryption algorithm. And the reason that we have to understand all of them is we can't always use AES, and we have to drop down to triple DES, or we may even have to use DES. For any of you that have set up VPNs, and I don't think I have a lab in this class that does VPNs, but there are other classes where you're going to do some labs where you set up VPNs. And what you're going to learn is that setting up VPNs, it's not hard to set up VPNs because the software does most of the work for you. All you have to do is try to set up which algorithms you're going to use, and you have a lot of choices. So, you could use AES, triple DES, or DES. Then you can pick a hash algorithm. You can pick your time, your time limits and all that sort of thing, and some other settings and configurations. But there's so many different ones. One of the things that's frustrating about VPNs is figuring out which combination of settings is going to work between two different firewalls or two different devices. And sometimes, even though both devices might have implemented AES, you can't always get that to work with all of the other configuration settings. So sometimes you just have to give up and you have to drop it to something else. I've had to set up VPNs recently that use DES. Most firewalls still support DES, and sometimes, maybe you've got two different vendors. There are some known issues with other implementations, so your only choice is to go to DES. And to be fair, DES is better than nothing. I mean, obviously we want to use AES if we can, but if we have no other option, DES is going to be the best option if our only other option is to use no encryption at all. And you can mitigate that. So if you do have to use something like DES, you can certainly mitigate it by using very low lifetime so that it's changing the symmetric key more frequently. You can use perfect forward secrecy and things like that. Try to mitigate that risk of using a much lower standard. Those three, though, DES, triple DES, and AES, are the major ones. Those are the most common symmetric algorithms that are used for most business communication on account of the fact that it's implemented in most firewalls for VPNs, and it's also implemented in TLS and SSL. But there are other algorithms. CAST is another algorithm. Here we have, up to 128-bit key, which again is significantly better than we have with DES, and with just one pass through the encryption, we have much better encryption, so it could be certainly a little bit more efficient. So your book does talk about CAST. RC is the other one. So there was a bunch of different versions of RC, a bunch of different iterations. RC4 was the one I think that was most commonly implemented. But one thing I should mention about RC. Almost all of the algorithms that I've discussed so far are block algorithms, where RC is a stream-based algorithm. So it's a stream cipher as opposed to a block cipher. Block ciphers encrypt data in blocks, in contiguous blocks of data, whereas stream encryption or stream cipher uses much smaller sections of data. It uses much smaller bits of data, that are less contiguous. So it's good for real-time communications. It's good for when you need something more efficient or whatever. There's a time and a place to use these stream-based or stream ciphers, but we don't have to use them. They're not common. And RC is one of the few that is stream in the symmetric category. At least in your textbook, this is the only one I think your textbook talks about that's a stream-based cipher. But I should mention that RC4 is basically broken. There's been quite a few flaws found in RC4, so it is discussed in your book. This is one of those algorithms, though, that we should probably avoid because of the flaws that exist in RC4. Another one is Blowfish. It was designed in 1984 by Bruce Schneider. If you have never heard of Bruce Schneider, I would suggest looking him up on the internet. He has some podcasts, and he does a almost weekly newsletter on IT security, and he always has some really good insight. He's a pretty sharp guy. I always get a lot of information from reading things that he writes, so I would certainly highly recommend looking into him. But one of the things that he's done for IT security is he developed an algorithm called Blowfish. I believe that Bruce Schneider works for British Telecom, I think. But as part of his work there, I think he developed Blowfish. So again, that's another symmetric algorithm. It does not have as wide use as DES, triple DES, and AES, but it's another one to be aware of. And one final one that I'm not very familiar with, which is IDEA, International Data Encryption Algorithm. which came out in 1992. So your book talks about this one. I've never used it. All the other ones I've used and I've had to work with before, but this is one that I have very little experience with. But again, it's another one to be aware of. All right, so a summary of symmetric key encryption. They're important because they're very fast, and I think we talked about that in the previous class, where we talk about how much faster symmetric algorithms are. So usually the bulk of our encryption in any encryption system, encryption isn't always just a single algorithm. A lot of times these, almost all cases, these different algorithms are combined for secure communication. We don't just use one of them. We combine different aspects of these. And I think I talk about that in a previous class where I show, how we use an asymmetric algorithm to get a key for a symmetric algorithm as an example. That's why we're using, different standards and different protocols kind of come together. And some standards and protocols are really just a collection of these different algorithms. So when you look at things like SSL and TLS, they're nothing more than a collection of all of these algorithms put together to achieve some purpose with encryption. So they typically don't stand alone. It's a combination of these. But in that suite of protocols, in that collection of encryption technologies, the symmetric category is very fast compared to the other ones. But you have to have the same key, which is the main weakness. So that is the big weakness. And the key itself is a weakness if the key isn't strong enough, as in the case with DES, only 56-bit. It's a relatively poor key as far as length goes. So let's talk about asymmetric encryption. There's a couple different standards we'll talk about: RSA, DiffieHellman, LJamal, and ECC. So asymmetric encryption, the whole idea of asymmetric encryption, the concept of it, the math behind it, and how it works, and this idea of a trapdoor function, this all kind of came about in 1975 with Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. You may have heard those names before. DiffieHellman, it's one of the things we're going to talk about. They have a protocol named after them. So it uses two keys instead of one, which we've demonstrated in previous classes. I think you would have seen that we have a public key and a private key. And it's the basically you exchange that public key, but you keep the private key a secret. And the only thing somebody can do with the public key is encrypt your data, and then you have to decrypt that with your private key. And this is what we use to exchange those keys for symmetric encryption, which is more efficient as far as the encryption goes, but less secure because of the issue with the keys having to be the same. So public key encryption, it works by using hard math problems. So a common method relies on the difficulty of factoring large numbers. And I think I talked about how this trapdoor works in the previous class. We talked about sort of the math behind this. But basically, what it comes down to is something like factoring. If I told you to multiply 7 times 8, I think most of you could do that relatively quickly. You could say, oh yeah, it's 56 or whatever it is. But if I gave you a number, right? So if I give you the number, I don't know, 48, and I said, tell me what numbers I can multiply, what two numbers I can multiply to get 48, a lot of you probably have to think about that for a minute, right? So maybe not a minute, but a lot of you are probably thinking about that right now, and you probably came up with the answer 6, times whatever. But the bottom line is, it takes longer to do factoring than it takes to do multiplication. And that's what a trapdoor is, and that's really how these public key encryption algorithms work. I think I had a lab where, I don't remember whether it was in this class or if we did it in the previous class, where I asked you to go online and learn a little bit about the RSA algorithm, and you can see how this trapdoor function works with factoring. But factoring is the primary tool used in most of the public key encryption algorithms that are used today. Although there's some newer ones which are gaining popularity that we'll talk about. So RSA, which is developed by these three guys, Rivish, Shamir, and Adelman. So it's one of the first public key algorithms that was invented. It was published in 1997. That doesn't mean it was invented in 1997. They invented it long before that, but it was published in 1997. It was proprietary prior to being published. It was used for encryption and digital signatures. And it uses the product of two very large prime numbers between 100 and 200 digits long. and of equal length. So two numbers of equal length that are very, very long, which of course is very difficult to factor, if not impossible, unless you brute force it. So it's a simple algorithm, but it has withstood the test of more than 20 years of analysis. It's still a strong algorithm. It's still, there's no shortcut. There's no backdoor, right? So you got the trap door, but is there a backdoor that lets us sort of bypass or shunt around all this hard math? And the answer is not really. For RSA, there doesn't seem to be a way to do that. But it can't replace symmetric encryption. It's about 100 times slower than DES, for example. And DES is, not the slowest algorithm as far as symmetric goes. Or I'm sorry, not the fastest as far as symmetric goes, but it's about 100 times slower than DES. So it's still significantly faster to use symmetric, but so much more secure when we don't have to worry about the passphrase. So it's usually used to exchange symmetric keys, as I said before. So DiffieHellman, which was created in 1976 by Diffie and Hellman, it's one of the most common encryption protocols in use today. It's used in the electronic exchange method for SSL. It's used in TLS, SSH, IPsec, and it enables the sharing of a secret key between two people who have not contacted each other before. If you're going into a firewall and you're going to set up a VPN, I would say probably 9 times out of 10 you're going to be using DiffieHellman for the key exchange. It'll actually say DiffieHellman in there, and you'll configure a couple of the parameters, usually DiffieHellman Group 1 or Group 2 or something like that. But I'm sure you've seen that if you've ever configured a VPN or a firewall in the past. So LJamal, I am not that familiar with LJamal. I've heard of it, but I haven't really had to use it. It's from the early 80s. Your book does talk about this quite a bit. It's got a couple of paragraphs that discusses it. It can be used for both encryption and digital signatures. It was never patented. It's free for use. It's used as the U.S. government standard for digital signatures, and it's been in use for a long time. Apparently, it's common for digital signatures, which is probably why I'm not as familiar with it. Digital signatures is not my specialty, but LJamal is the other example. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to have a different video that you can watch that we're going to discuss certificates and basically trust using. So we're going to talk about how to use these encryption standards, how they're implemented for digital certificates and digital signatures.